Welcome to another episode of Books and Bytes.
Today we're diving into a real giant of literature.
That's right, Miguel de Cervantes' Don Quixote, published way back in two parts, 1605 and 1615.
And it's not just old, it's foundational, often called the first modern novel.
Yeah, it mixes so much together, satire, adventure, some pretty deep philosophy too.
Absolutely. And what we want to do today is sort of unpack the essentials. Look at that core tension between, idealism and realism through Don Quixote and his squire, Sancho Panza.
And the whole power of imagination, how stories shape us.
Exactly. That's the mission.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Who was this guy before he became Don Quixote?
Well, he starts as Alonso Quixano, just a middle-aged gent from La Mancha.
And he's completely obsessed with reading chivalry books, right?
To the point where it breaks his brain a bit.
Yeah.
Cervantes famously writes, "From little sleep and much reading, his brain dried up and he lost his wits."
Wow. So he literally reads himself into becoming someone else.
Pretty much. He decides the world needs knights-errant again, and he's going to be one.
So Alonso Quixano is gone.
And Don Quixote La Mancha emerges. He even gets some rather rusty ancestral armor.
And his horse. Not exactly a noble steed, I gather?
No, just an old nag, but he gives it this grand name, Rocinante.
Everything has to fit the fantasy, including a lady love.
Of course. Dulcinea del Toboso, his idealized woman.
Who, in reality, is?
Aldonza Lorenzo, a local farm girl. And she hasn't got a clue about any of this.
So the gap between his world and the real world is there from the very start.
Absolutely. And his knighting ceremony really sets the stage for that.
Right. He rocks up to an inn.
Thinks it's a castle.
And convinces the innkeeper to knight him.
Yeah, the innkeeper seems to sort of play along, probably finding it all quite amusing. Gets a couple of local women involved, too. It's theater of the absurd, really. A
very shaky start to a life of chivalry.
And reality hits him pretty hard, pretty fast.
You mean the incident with the merchants?
Exactly. He demands that they praise Dulcinea, they mock him instead.
And he tries to attack them, but ends up getting a beating himself.
Not very knightly. It's that immediate clash. His ideals versus, the consequences.
So he gets hauled back home, and his friends try to help.
His friends, the local priest and barber, they see the cause of the problem. His books.
Ah, the book burning scene, the inquisition of his library.
Right. They go through his library, burn most of the chivalry books.
Until an enchanter did it, to sort of shield him.
Yeah, they wall up his library, invent this story, but it doesn't really cure him.
No, because then he finds a partner.
Enter Sancho Panza, a local farmer, very practical, very different from Don Quixote.
What convinces Sancho to go along with this? It seems crazy.
The promise of becoming governor of an island. Don Quixote dangles this prize, and for Sancho, that's, a pretty big deal.
So you've got the ultimate idealist and the ultimate realist teamed up.
Precisely. And that dynamic is just central to the whole book. It's where so much of the humor, but also the depth, comes from. That constant push and pull.
Which brings us to maybe the most famous scene of all.
The windmills.
Look there, friend Sancho.
Those are giants! Yes! He genuinely sees these towering giants he has to fight.
Even though Sancho's yelling, "No, they're windmills."
Doesn't matter. Don Quixote charges, lance against windmill sail.
And the result is predictable.
Painful and predictable. He gets knocked flat. But does he learn? Not really. He blames it on enchantments changing the giants into windmills at the last second.
This pattern just keeps repeating, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely. Throughout part one, he attacks monks thinking they're kidnappers.
Frees those galley slaves who then attack him.
Right. Gratitude isn't really part of their plan.
And mistakes a simple barber's basin for the legendary helmet of Mambrino.
Each time, it's that same formula. His chivalric fantasy slams into mundane reality.
Now, Cervantes does something really interesting with the narration itself. It's not straightforward.
Not at all. He uses this metafictional framing device. He claims he's not the original author.
Right, he's just translating or compiling the work of this supposed Moorish historian, Cid Hamet Benengeli.
Which was quite revolutionary for the time. It makes you constantly aware you're reading a constructed story. He's playing with ideas of authorship and historical truth.
It adds a whole other layer. And then there are stories within the story, too.
Yes, the embedded tales, like the tale of ill-advised curiosity.
Or those complex love stories they encounter in the Sierra Morena.
These aren't just random diversions. They often echo or comment on the main themes: love, jealousy, deception, illusion versus reality. They broaden the novel's scope.
And Cervantes himself sometimes just pops in to talk directly to the reader.
Yeah, breaking the fourth wall, offering commentary. It feels very modern, actually.
So fast forward 10 years, part 2 comes out. And things have changed.
Massively. Because part 1 was a huge success. People had actually read it.
So in part 2, characters know about Don Quixote and Sancho.
Exactly. They've read the book. Don Quixote finds out he's famous or infamous. It completely blurs the line between fiction and the reality within the fiction.
That must have been mind-bending for readers back then.
Absolutely. And Cervantes even uses it to take a shot at an unauthorized sequel that someone else published.
He has Don Quixote encounter the fake book and dismiss it.
He does. It's a brilliant way to assert his own authority over his characters.
This fame leads them to the Duke and Duchess. And that section is, well, different.
It is. The Duke and Duchess have read part 1 and they decide to have some fun. Cruel fun, really.
They set up these elaborate pranks, playing directly into Don Quixote's delusions just for their own amusement.
It gets quite uncomfortable times seeing him manipulated like that.
But amidst all this mockery, Sancho gets his island. Sort of.
Yes, the island of Barataria. It's a complete setup, part of the Duke and Duchess's games.
But Sancho actually does okay as governor, doesn't he? Surprisingly wise.
He really does. He shows this unexpected common sense and fairness in his judgments. It's a fascinating interlude.
Until he resigns. That quote is amazing. Naked I was born, naked I find myself. I neither win nor lose.
Such a profound moment. He sees through the charade, understands the burden and artificiality of it all. A big step for Sancho.
The pranks continue, though. Altisidora pretending to be in love with Don Quixote.
And the whole ridiculous business about Dulcinea being enchanted, needing Sancho to whip himself thousands of times to free her.
It shows how far people will go for entertainment, I suppose.
But something else happens in part 2. The relationship between the two main characters starts to shift.
How so?
Well, you see Don Quixote having moments where he seems almost lucid, questioning things.
And Sancho?
Sancho starts absorbing some of his master's perspective. He's still pragmatic, but maybe a little more open to the imaginative side, having seen so much strangeness. They influence each other.
There are some key adventures, too. That trip into the Cave of Montesinos.
Which is incredibly surreal. Is it a dream? Is it real? Even Don Quixote isn't sure.
And he has these encounters with other knights.
The Knight of the Mirrors, the Knight of the White Moon, both turn out to be Sancho Carrasco, a friend from back home.
In disguise, trying to force Don Quixote to give up and return home.
Exactly. It's another layer of deception, but this time with a different motive, trying to help him, in a way.
And the encounter with the printing press in Barcelona? That must have been strange for Don Quixote.
Imagine. Seeing his own story, the one he's living, literally being printed. Talk about metafiction.
Ultimately, though, he's defeated.
Yes, by the Knight of the White Moon Carrasco again. The terms of defeat mean he has to go home for a year.
And it's back in his village that the final change happens.
He falls ill, and on his deathbed, his sanity returns.
Completely.
Completely. He renounces Don Quixote, renounces knight-errantry, renounces the books. I was mad, and now I am sane, he says. He even apologizes.
It's quite moving, but also kind of sad, isn't it? The end of the dream.
It is, and ironically, it's Sancho who begs him not to give up, to go on another adventure.
A total role reversal.
But Alonso Quixano, the good, as he calls himself now, is resolved. He makes his will and dies peacefully.
We should spend a moment just on Sancho.
Yeah.
His development is huge.
Absolutely. He goes from the simple, slightly greedy peasant,
motivated by the island,
to someone really complex and, frankly, lovable.
All those proverbs he uses, sometimes correctly, sometimes not.
They show his folk wisdom, his connection to the earth, and despite everything, he develops this incredible loyalty to Don Quixote. He sticks with him.
We saw his wisdom as governor.
And that final plea to Don Quixote not to die, arguing that letting melancholy kill you is the greatest madness. It shows how much he's grown and how much he cares.
What about the women in the novel? Dulcinea is more of an idea than a person.
She is. She's the ideal, constructed entirely in Don Quixote's mind. He even says, I see her as she needs to be, acknowledging that his vision matters more than Aldonza Lorenzo's reality.
But there are other female characters with more substance.
Definitely. Think of Dorotea. She's incredibly resourceful, disguises herself, takes charge of her own destiny to pursue the man who wronged her. She's got real agency.
Not just a damsel in distress.
Far from it. And you have others, Maritornes, the inn servant, the manipulative duchess, Don Quixote's concerned niece and housekeeper. They represent different facets of women's lives at the time.
Through all these characters and adventures, we get a real snapshot of 17th century Spain.
We really do. It's a society in flux, caught between old medieval ways and new modern pressures.
You see all levels of society.
From the nobles like the Duke and Duchess down to innkeepers, muleteers, students, actors. It's a rich social panorama.
And religion is present. Economic worries sometimes intrude on Don Quixote's fantasies.
Yes, the harsh realities of life, poverty, social hierarchy, the power of the church, they form the backdrop against which Don Quixote plays out his illusions.
And literarily, the book was just groundbreaking.
Utterly. Cervantes' use of psychological realism was revolutionary. These aren't just stock figures. Don Quixote and Sancho feel like real, complex, evolving people.
The dialogue feels natural, too.
Very much so. It reveals character, drives the plot, and is often genuinely funny.
Plus, the narrative tricks, we mentioned multiple narrators, the metafiction.
All incredibly innovative, blurring fiction and reality, using an unreliable narrator, mixing genres like romance, comedy, tragedy, picaresque. He threw out the rule book.
So summing up the big themes, that core conflict is key.
Idealism versus realism, and the novel doesn't offer easy answers. It shows the beauty and necessity of ideals, but also the dangers of ignoring reality.
Appearance versus reality is huge, too. What seems real often isn't.
And how much literature itself shapes our perception of reality, for better or worse.
It explores identity, madness, freedom.
Comedy and tragedy woven together, often in the same scene.
It's no wonder its legacy is so enormous.
Its influence is everywhere. Art, music, opera. The word quixotic itself, man of La Mancha, it tapped into something universal.
Why do you think it still speaks to us so strongly?
Well, that gap between our dreams and the world as it is, that's timeless. The relationship between Don Quixote and Sancho is incredibly relatable. Cervantes' humor is deep, but also compassionate. And maybe it's that self-awareness, the way the novel talks about storytelling itself. It feels endlessly interpretable.
So wrapping up our deep dive, Don Quixote clearly isn't just a dusty classic. It's vibrant, funny, tragic, and incredibly insightful about being human.
Absolutely. It forces us to think about our own ideals, our own realities, and the stories we tell ourselves.
To really experience its richness, you've got to read it. We encourage you to grab a copy of the book. There's a link in the description.
You won't regret it.
And subscribe to Books and Bytes.
And maybe, as a final thought, think about the windmills in your own life. What seems like a giant might just depend on how you choose to look at it, right? And what does it mean to chase an ideal even when reality pushes back?